Okay, so we're going to move on to look at chapters 4 and 5 in the American Pageant. This video will be for chapter 4. These are the last two chapters that we have to look at over the summer, and they're very general in nature in terms of the fact that we're looking at how people lived in the colonies. And it's a very broad, generalized approach. Just looking at trying to get ourselves in the mindset of what was happening day to day. This chapter we're looking very early, from the beginning of the colonies up through towards the end of the 1600s, and then chapter 5 we look at a little bit more specifically because they're looking at what society looked like leading up to the Revolution to help try to explain that social and political aspect of revolution and of independence. So there's some really interesting things that are happening in this chapter. And so I'll try not to talk too much, but you get the point. If you've been watching these, I could talk about this stuff forever. The first thing we're going to look at is in the Chesapeake, in Virginia, then in Maryland, the fact that, and we mentioned this a little bit before when we looked at the settling of the colonies, that disease was very rampant in this area. Diseases, especially that the colonists that came were not used to dealing with. They settled in a swamp, literally in a swamp. So if you know anything about that stagnant water, it brings mosquitoes, and with mosquitoes comes a host of disease like malaria. We also, because it's in a swamp, the water is not clean, and so that contributes to dysentery and others. So if you can see here that coming to pointedly Jamestown, but also Virginia in general, at least in those first 10, 20, maybe even 30 years, it actually decreased one's life expectancy. That's not something that most people jump at the chance to do. So it's interesting to see that people still decided to come, that they must have hoped for some sort of success to take that risk. Looking at half of the people born in Virginia and Maryland not surviving until 20 is drastic. No one expects a 20-year life expectancy at 10. You're middle-aged. No one expects something like that. Even though life expectancy was at a lower age than what we're used to now, it certainly wasn't normal to be at 20. We know in the beginning with Jamestown that mostly single men came. We're looking at that kind of disgruntled class of young men who didn't have a chance to inherit in England. They're looking for adventure. They're looking for a name, something. So they came. And so there were 3 times more men than women in the early beginnings of both Virginia and Maryland, which makes it very difficult to keep a society going without further immigration. So women were especially prized in the Chesapeake colonies. So they will actually have a little bit more control over their destinies. Being a woman, you had all of these men fighting over you because there were so few, so that you can kind of push for better treatment. However, you're also looking at going into a situation where you're not going to live very long. And you can see here by the weak family ties. Interesting fact here that by the time the oldest child in the house was 20, if he or she lived that long, the chance that the husband and wife, the two that were married at that point in time, probably were not even related to that oldest child anymore. Through the unhealthy climate and deaths and remarriages and things, families were very difficult to sort through. A lot of stepchildren, half-children. So then you have stepbrothers and half-brothers and sisters and such. That family was not as clear-cut as we're going to see in New England. But things do turn around. People are able to spread out more. They move out of the swamp. The farther away they can move from that, the healthier it is. And by the 18th century, so by the time, especially by the time we start looking at revolutionary America, Virginia is the most populous colony. So it's pretty remarkable to look at a situation where it took so long to get that colony sustaining itself that they had to keep having people migrate there just in order to keep it going to becoming the most populous is quite a feat for that time. And much of this is due to the success of tobacco. That really forces the people to spread out farther because they want more and more land for tobacco. I think we talked about in one of the chapters how every available piece of land was dedicated to growing tobacco. So you could go into even a cemetery and seeing the grass in between each headstone or whatever they used for graves at the time planted with tobacco because people were so addicted to it, especially in England, and they're sending it over and they're getting good prices. And of course, the higher the prices, the more money you're making. And so we start to plant more and more, which then calls into question who is going to farm this. If I'm a man in Virginia or Maryland and I own a farm and maybe that farm is growing, I can't do that myself. And so we first are looking at using indentured servants. And I'm sure you've heard of this term before, but just as a quick review, an indentured servant is someone who's willing to come to the colonies. They can't pay. And so someone already established will pay that passage, and in return, the servant works for that person for a set period of years. Usually it's somewhere about 5 to 7 years. Oftentimes, the indentured servant has to stay on and kind of maybe not draw out, but increase their length of time because they still can't afford to buy their own land or sustain themselves there. So a lot of people ended up being indentured servants pretty much their entire lives. After we start to see more suitable land available and more people willing to come to the colonies, we use something called the headright system because the land was available and it was pretty much free for these companies to use. So if I have the money to pay for a passage for someone, I would be rewarded with 50 acres of land. So that fuels these land-hungry people to pay the passage to get more people over. So by 1700, we have about 100,000 indentured servants aimed to the Chesapeake. And when we look at the Chesapeake colonies, we're mainly talking about Virginia and Maryland because of their location on the Chesapeake. However, even though it seems at the time that land is bountiful, it's not, they will run out. There's not an unlimited supply. And I just noticed a mistake right here. I apologize. This should say freedom dues. Because oftentimes for the indentured servants, once you did your time of service, the person you were working for would reward you, or you might have been working partially towards owning some land. But as it's becoming scarce, no one wanted to reward others. So that would be more popular early on there. So that should say freedom dues. I'm sorry about that. Let's see. Okay. As Jamestown and as Virginia and Maryland grow, there is a need for something local to control the people. They are under the jurisdiction of the Crown of England in general, but there has to be some go-between, obviously. And we know that in Virginia, starting in 1619, there was a local government, a House of Burgesses, which had some limited power but showed us a step towards democracy because even though limited numbers could participate, the people still could participate. And that Virginia Assembly in 1670 made a move to disenfranchise, which means take a vote away from landless freemen. So if you didn't own land, you could not vote, which seemed very unfair to many people because then the wealthy, which we're going to talk about later, we're seeing a gap, a wealthy class grow and a whole lot of people not wealthy also grow, that they can't participate if they're not wealthy. And that isn't really how many of us would feel about democracy. Today, for example, you do not have to own land to vote. You do have to live somewhere. You do have to have a residence to establish where you will be voting, but you don't have to own land in order to vote. That you don't have to own a certain amount of money. You don't have to do any of those things in order to vote. So this was a step towards restricting some of those people. And that was one thing. It was one factor that was kind of building up in some frustration for some people who weren't able to make tons of money like others could. There's also, we are still dealing with the Native Americans. In the previous chapter, we talked about some conflict in general. We talked about, some attempts at a truce and such. But as the colonies continue to expand, they will run into Native Americans, and often that turns into conflict. And Governor Berkeley in Virginia tried to keep some sense of a friendly truce with the Native Americans in Virginia. And there appear to be some attacks on the frontier. And when we're looking at the frontier, we're looking just at the edge of the colony. And it's not very clear what precipitated or what came before these attacks. Was it a situation where Native Americans were just annoyed that the colonists were spreading out? Possibly. Was it a situation that the colonists were starting an incident? Possibly as well. We don't know. But what we do know is that the governor at the time did not retaliate against some of these situations. And it caused the people living on the frontier to believe that their lives, their situations, were not as important to the government as those who lived closer to it. Because as the colony is spreading out, the people are moving farther and farther away from the seat of government or from the capital, which at this point was Jamestown. And so those interests may have seemed to be more important. And so a man named Nathaniel Bacon actually rises up, and he gets a group of people together and is going to take revenge. He's going to exact revenge on the Native Americans. They do that, and then they turn their frustrations on the government. They feel that there's no regard again for their experiences in the West, and so they want to take over. And they get this gang of people together. They go in, they march on Jamestown. Berkeley's actually flees. He's worried for his life, what they would do to him if he's caught, and they burn the Capitol. So it's a very serious and early rebellion that we see, and it's something that continues. Some may argue even to this day that geography plays a motivating factor in some people's frustration. That because obviously when the colonies were first started, people tended to live on the coasts, so that's where their early cities were. But as they move out, that representation or that seat of government didn't move out with them. So they're feeling physically disconnected, and then socially and politically disconnected as well. What happens in this case is Nathaniel Bacon gets sick. I think it's dysentery. I can't remember exactly, but he dies, and his leadership was really what was holding this ragtag bunch of rebels together, and so it fell apart. Berkeley returns, rebels are hanged, and make an example out of. This is not the way we go about demonstrating any sort of frustration, but it does give people some pause to think about, is there a better way to represent the interests of everyone? And it's something that they're really going to have to struggle with or grapple with all the way through the federal period. And I'll probably say this again once we get closer, but when we do start to make states during the Revolutionary War, the capitals in many of those states are created in cities that might be viewed a little bit more central, or at least not as eastern. A very perfect example is New York. Obviously, at the time, the seat of activity in New York would be New York City. It still is. It's one of the more populous places in our state. But when we created a capital, they created the capital in Albany to try to create a state government that would be more representative of the entire state and not just the interests of New York City. But that's just one example, and we can see that early frustration already happening. Another situation that develops in the Chesapeake colonies very quickly, I should say, not frequently, is the increase in slaves. As the tobacco plantations are expanding and that need for labor is more and more necessary, it's clear that indentured servitude is not going to cut it. Not as many people felt that they needed to move from England. Wages were increasing in England. Land was not as scarce as people thought. People just didn't want to take the chance. A variety of factors. Great Britain itself was already, I guess I should say England, it's not Great Britain yet, participated in the slave trade and became more of a larger part of the slave trade. So that also helps explain how more and more slaves could be brought into the colonies in North America. We're looking at, in 1619, maybe 20 slaves entering Virginia, and after 1700, we have about 400,000, and that's going to very quickly increase. And early slavery, I think we talked about this before, was more like an indentured servitude situation. There was a possibility of freedom, but as the colonies become more tied to this plantation system, there's no benefit economically to them granting freedom to anyone. And so very gradually they will start to put restrictions on the slaves that are in the colonies. You could see a few here, forbidden to carry firearms, obviously, then they can't rebel. But even some such things as testifying in court, so that way if there is some illegal activity with the slaves or anything else, they can't testify. They can't. So it says engage in commercial activity, so they can't trade on their own. They couldn't own a business if they were free. Can't own property, congregate in public, travel without permission, marry. That's a big one, because what we see with slavery is not only needing to import them, but also to trade. And it becomes an internal trade as well as an external trade, meaning they're going to trade slaves throughout. And if slaves do marry and have a family, it's kind of a catch-22. We want them to have a family because then we can increase the number of slaves and hopefully increase maybe their ability to be content. But also it means ripping apart those families if there is trade, which does happen throughout the South, which we'll talk about, especially as we move into the period before the Civil War. And eventually it also becomes a crime to teach a slave to read or write. We don't want ideas. They didn't want those ideas of freedom or anything else to take root. The deeper South that we're talking about, the more harsh life was for the slaves. Again, we'll talk about this more as we approach the Civil War. But as we move into the late 1600s, the early 1700s, there's more female slaves imported, which then also creates a situation where we can have more slaves. Slavery follows the mother, and it does this very purposefully, because then women, when they have babies, regardless of the parentage, meaning regardless of the situation of the father, that baby will be a slave. And here it says it makes family life possible, which is true. There were some marriages, even though they wouldn't necessarily be legal in state or in colonial law, in practicality they existed, and so they'd have babies and there'd be slaves. But it also created a situation where masters could create their own increase in slave population, so they often engaged in some sexual activity with their female slaves to create more slaves, which is a horrifying thing to think about, but was very much a reality in some situations, that because it follows the mother, that it doesn't matter who the father is. So that we will see, and we will talk more about that, we will see more of a mixed race of children, and many can tie that to some sort of, I hesitate to use the word relationship. In some situations it may have been, I'm sure, well, maybe you haven't, but we'll talk about Thomas Jefferson. That's more of a relationship situation as to a forced situation. But what we also see is that we're having a distinct cultural emergence happen at this time. At first, when we're importing slaves from Africa, they're bringing some of their traditions from Africa here, but very quickly we are disconnected from Africa, because the slaves that we're going to be talking about were born in the colonies, so they don't really have that connection to Africa. And so we'll see this other culture emerge, especially when we start talking about music and jazz. That's something that comes out of the South from a slave culture to be very popular. We do see some attempts to resist slavery. You can see here I mentioned a couple. They're not successful. And all they really serve to do is to cause fear among their owners. And the response to that fear is to crack down harder. So what some slaves very quickly learn is there are other ways to rebel without resorting to some sort of wide-scale Nat Turner-like rebellion. Rather, take a really long time to do your job, become sick, break some tools unobtrusively so that we don't know that it's you breaking them, but you can't get your work done. All of those were more subtle ways to try to improve the situation, because it's very clear that armed revolt is not going to work. In terms of the rest of society in the South, we're going to see a very aristocratic and very defined social structure emerge here, all based upon wealth. And it's a very, very small, elite, wealthy class that emerges, and these are the people that are dominating the House of Burgesses, or that representative assembly. So they're going to be the people who make sure that their own interests are taken care of, and that is a very wide gap. It's very difficult to be a middle of the road or a middle class. There really wasn't much of a middle class. Many people aspired to be these plantation owners, but the fact is there's only so much land and there's only so much ability to create these plantations, but it still represented this ideal. We do not have a lot of cities emerge very early in the South. This is something that we mentioned because when we look at New England, we will see cities, because who would waste the space to build a city? You don't need it. What you need is land for tobacco. And so you're not going to sacrifice that for a more urban feel. You can ship that stuff out and it goes to England, and you import things, so you don't need a commercial center really. We will see some, but not much. And we also aren't going to sacrifice any land to building roads or anything like that. And so they will use waterways for the most part as transportation in the South, traveling, from place to place via the water. Now, switching to New England, we find a really different scenario. The very first point here says that coming to New England actually increased a person's life expectancy. So in thinking about it, the draw obviously going to New England would be a much healthier life. You can add 10 years to your life expectancy instead of decreasing it so dramatically by going to the South. So that's great. The population is able to double very, very quickly. It says every 27 years. We have a better, more balanced diet. In New England, they're mostly doing subsistence farming, so they're growing a variety of things in that harsher climate that can withstand the climate, but also is enough to balance the diet better. So a life expectancy of 60 years in colonial times is just amazing. It's not, now if we look at 80 or slightly 80 plus for life expectancy today in 2016, that's amazing to think that in 1700 people were living to be 60 in New England, and this creates a different family structure too than what we saw in Virginia. By the time the kids are older, both of the parents were probably step parents, whereas here we see a much larger generational kind of thing with the family. They knew their grandparents. They certainly had their parents around. So they would have their grandparents and things like that. Early marriage, high birth rate. So we have more, families with more people in them directly related. Very different role, though, for women, because I don't want to say they're not as prized in New England as they were in Virginia, but in Virginia, because they were scarce in the beginning, life was so fragile, death was a real possibility very early, that women were more in demand. They're not as much in New England, so their rights are not as important. There's no bargaining chip. In the South, they could bargain because they had these men who needed a wife, and there's only so many women. In New England, it wasn't like that. So you could see they don't own property, and that's something that we'll come back to when we talk about the Salem witch trials. But they couldn't own their own property, so it was either their husband or their father, maybe a brother if it was necessary. They can't vote, certainly could not vote. They're looked at as morally weaker, which is interesting because a lot of the moral guiding of the kids was left to the women, but they just, it's an Adam and Eve type kind of situation that the women couldn't stand up to that pressure. And they do, though, find their, I guess, niche or avenue as midwives. Women were pretty much the only ones who were midwives in New England. Life, day-to-day life, is built around a village, small village and farms, but the villages were very orderly. So this is something that we're looking at laying out basically based around religion. We know it's very highly Puritan, or what we're going to call congregational. And so each town was very carved up and planned. Specifically, we have to have a meeting house, which is often the church, and served as government as well, depending on the day of the week. They would have houses, they would have a village green, which would be a common area, and if there were more than 50 families living in an area, there had to be a school. And at the very least, everyone, boys and girls, had to learn how to read, because you have to be able to read the Bible. Beyond that, education will differ, and as we grow older, the girls are probably not educated, and if they were, it was in entirely different things as the boys, but they have to be able to read. And a very early nod to education here is 1636 Harvard College is started, so that's Harvard University today, but that was started as a way to train clergy, but also to advance education. And we do see an element of democracy with town meetings with the men and church members. They had to be church members in New England. Now, what we do start to see, though, as we move away from the initial time of founding of the colonies, is the fact that people are not as intense in their religious fervor or their religious feelings as they were when they first came to the colonies. And so this worries the clergy. They're here going, what are we going to do? And they're yelling at their parishioners weekly, like, aren't you afraid of going to hell? And why aren't as many people converting or having the conversion experience, which was something visible that needed to be demonstrated to the community to have full membership in the church. So what they had to do is make a decision, and how important is that conversion experience, or at least that public conversion experience, to them, because they were losing numbers. And so they came up with something called the halfway covenant, which you can have partial membership rights in the church even if you did not have this conversion experience. And we're looking at kind of the people, young adults, who may not have been part of the church. We, as Catholics or some other Christians, we view ourselves as church members. We're baptized. We're welcomed into the church. This is not the same with the Puritans here, as you have to have this conversion experience as an adult to prove that you're accepting this life. And they had to really struggle with this, is, do we want this really pure membership here, or do we want a large congregation? And they kind of had to sacrifice some of their purity, in the sense that they didn't require such an intense display in order to have a larger church. Also, something that happened at this time was an outbreak of witch trials in Salem, which I find absolutely fascinating, because it starts with a group of young girls. They're like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, that age bracket. And they claim to be under the spell of a witch. There's a variety of reports on how this got started. I'm reading a really cool book. I'm sure you wouldn't find it as cool as I do, but it's called After the Fact, The Art of Historical Detection. And we're going to look at part of that in terms of how historians have to piece together what we look at as how did the events unfold. And for something like the Salem witch trials, it's really hard, because we're looking at court documents, we're looking at people's testimony, we're looking at other things, and we really don't know what started this, except that it started with this group of girls. One version tells us that they got caught doing something that they shouldn't have, and in order to stay out of trouble, which is a natural, I guess, defense mechanism among young people, is to lie. and say we were bewitched. And there was the involvement of a woman, Tituba, who may have been from Barbados. There is also some controversy where exactly she came from. She is accused as one of them. And in the beginning, there are 3 that we know of. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, Tituba are accused of bewitching the girls, and the fact that one of the girls is the daughter of the pastor is really bad, because they're thinking this holy man and his daughter is bewitched. They claim that these 3 women had come to them. There's these elaborate things that they do, and that their spirits are causing these fits, because this is what's happening with the girls, is they're laughing. They're Betty, who is the minister's daughter, is just laying on the bed, not moving. Their spirits are doing this, and it turns very much in the beginning, especially between the 2 Sarahs. She said. I'm not a witch, she's a witch. I'm not a witch, she's a witch, until Tituba actually confesses. She confesses to, signing this book of the devil and doing his work. And this throws this whole thing into a tailspin, because up until this point, it's just accusations. And you have to remember that looking at witches was very real, but this is making it more important in this situation that somebody actually confessed. So if she was a witch, then maybe others were too. And the accusations spread. And this is where things get dicey, because we start to look for patterns. That's what historians do, is they look for patterns. And why did this happen? When we look at, especially being skeptical today, I don't know how you feel about witches and witchcraft, but most people would probably say this is not what happened here, that there were not witches in Salem. Something else was going on. Maybe it started with girls who were afraid of getting in trouble, and it spread by people taking advantage of that and feeding the girls names to accuse. And we do look at that, and it turns into a little bit of a geography battle, that it's a east versus west as the town grew and kind of had almost like a suburb. That the accusations, when you plot a map, as 2 historians did, looked like accusers on one side and those accused on the other. And then that leads them into further investigation as to why. Is it land ownership? Is it money? There's some status symbols involved. And then there's this very interesting tie that they found with women, because many of the women who were accused were independent women, meaning that they were widows and had no one else to take ownership of their property or make their decisions, that they actually could do that for themselves. And that was not acceptable. So so they were already kind of this odd group that were unpopular, and so a lot of what happened here just played on that situation. There's also some explanations by historians that this could have been an example of kind of a mass hysteria, that we have these little problems, we have the geography issue, we have the status issue, we have that all kind of bubbling below the surface, and this event, this possibility of witches, brings it all to the surface, and it all breaks loose. And they look at some psychological studies about how groups can exhibit signs like this, not intentionally, but because of the psychology of different things around them. Some are looking at, especially with the girls involved, that it could be some extreme anxiety, which was really interesting reading those studies, because we've all been in a situation where we're a little anxious and maybe we're, sweating a little bit, or stuttering, or our heart's beating faster. And for some of us, myself included, they get worse. Our symptoms might be a little bit more worse than others. And so that maybe once this becomes a real possibility, that anxiety could have caused the girls to act in ways that seemed unexplainable. That's another possibility. And then there's also one that was popular for a while and doesn't seem to be as accepted anymore, is the fact that they could have been suffering from a poison which could have been found in mushrooms in the area that would cause them to hallucinate and cause some of these symptoms. So we don't know. As you can see here, we just don't know what caused this. What we do know is eventually it goes too far. The governor stops the witch trials. So many people were accused. 19 or 20 were actually killed as a result of this. And the only way to get out of it was to admit it. Admit you're a witch, accuse other people, and then you're forgiven. Whereas if you try to prove you're innocent, you really can't. And what's interesting is we're going to see this situation mirrored later with the communist witch hunts in the 1950s, that was a way to protect yourself. And so it kind of explains why some people would admit to it, because that's always this question, is why in the world would you say, yeah, I'm a witch, I'm in league with the devil, if you weren't? And people very quickly caught on that that's a way to spare your life. I mean, some people wouldn't admit it and would rather be killed, but self-preservation is an issue as well. So really fascinating time period here, which, as much as we look at historians and how they were able to piece it together, we do have a variety of explanations, but we really will never know what caused this. Maybe there really were witches. So change. Looking at New England life in general, it's ethnically homogeneous, which means that there's not a lot of diversity. Mostly English families coming there. Extreme climate, we know that they do have nice natural harbors, lots of forests, so we will have shipbuilding, we will have trade. They're going to be the cities that the merchants are coming, or the ships are coming in and dealing with the merchants, and some fishing, of course. And you can see here, New England isn't just what we think of as New England today. It actually goes out eventually to Oregon, which is certainly not what we think of as New England. Just looking very quickly here, majority of colonists were farmers, no matter where you were, whether it be subsistence or plantation. Women, men had very clear gender-specific roles. We do have an incident in New York City which looks at some difficulty with having the diversity, just because Jacob Leisler takes advantage of a situation and takes over after the governor has to step down in 1689 because of the Glorious Revolution, which we talked about in the last chapter. But when William and Mary came over, and remember, we're talking about New York here, so there's some real ties to the Netherlands and to England, so that's kind of played upon. And so Leisler takes advantage of this and establishes a government and rules until a new governor can arrive from England. And he's very popular among the Dutch and among small landowners because he's trying to undercut what the wealthy had already established. We have wealthy in almost every colony, and they seem to drive it. And so in 1691, a new English governor is able to arrive, and he does make sure that Leisler is charged with treason. He had no right whatsoever to take over in that colony, and he was actually hanged. But we do see again that there are some pieces that show us that there's some tension between the wealthy and the lower classes, which are going to be a situation that, you know, never is resolved, really. And that is our early society. I said I wouldn't talk so much, and I think this is even longer than the last video, so I apologize. But I think most of it was the witch trials, which I find fascinating. So the next thing that we're going to look at is then just the 18th century and the eve of revolution, and then we'll be caught up, and we will be doing this in person.